I was working at the time in Kitchener for a private firm, and I was looking for a more responsible position. I had, and I saw the Kingston advertisement in the Globe and Mail, I think, for a planning officer. So I responded and was hired. And I think the reason I was hired was because Kingston had just had a major annexation in which it had acquired Portsmouth Village and parts of the former township of Kingston. And it had to have a new zoning bylaw for this annexed area, which they wanted me to write. And they also had to take it through an Ontario Municipal Board hearing. And I had just been through that experience in Kitchener. They had just had a major annexation, and I was hired there to write the zoning bylaw for the annexed area, and also to participate in the Ontario Municipal Board hearings. Now at that time, the whole concept of planning as we know it today was pretty new. The Ontario Planning Act was only brought into force in 1946, shortly after the war. Now during the war, there were post-war reconstruction committees appointed by the federal government all across Canada, and their task was to look at the future of their municipalities after the war and to come up with various proposals. So that was perhaps the, if you like, the birth pangs of modern planning right across Canada, and in Kitchener and in Kingston. And under the new Planning Act, provision was made for the appointment of planning boards who were composed of citizens and also elected councillors, and they were to plan for the post-war futures of their municipalities. Excuse me. So Kingston already had a planning board, and it needed somebody who would write a zoning bylaw for the annexation area and also steer the municipality through the intricacies of an Ontario Municipal Board hearing. Now, even the Ontario Municipal Board was a fairly new organization, and so were Ontario Municipal Board hearings, so all this was new. Well, I had had the experience in Kitchener of going through this process, so I was perhaps a natural choice for Kingston to take it through the same process. So that's how I came to be here. I had an agenda, of course, and the agenda was annexation area, zoning bylaw, official plan. However, life isn't always like that. All sorts of unexpected things preempt agendas. And there are a couple of things that happened in Kingston. As I mentioned, I came here in 1955. In 1956, the front portico of the City Hall had to be removed because it was quite literally falling to pieces. And that was a bit of a crisis because the City Hall was an iconic building and a historic building. So a committee was formed to decide on ways and means of restoring the portico. Now, when the portico was removed, the city didn't put any money into a holding account to provide money for the construction of a new portico, but instead they formed a committee, and I was the secretary of that committee. So that's really how the historic building preservation movement got started, with the removal of the City Hall portico and the appointment of the committee. That special committee, which was to deal with the portico, eventually became the Heritage Preservation Committee, having responsibility for the whole historic building fabric of the city. Also, at the same time, a local minister in St. Paul's Anglican Church gave a speech to one of the local service clubs, which he said that the City of Kingston had the worst slums in Canada, and the worst slums in Kingston were in Rideau Heights. So there's a big headline in the paper about this. And the press went after the mayor, who was rather caught off guard, I think, and his response was that all cities have slums and you can't do anything about them. Well, there was a lot of public criticism about this, so the mayor appointed a committee, of which I was a secretary, to perhaps do something about Rideau Heights. So my agenda, which I thought had been confined to the matter of the annexation area and the new zoning bylaw, was infiltrated, shall we say, to some extent by the matter of historic building preservation, focusing in the beginning on the City Hall, but then later extending to the whole fabric, what you might call the old city, and also the matter of Rideau Heights. Now, there weren't many precedents for this kind of thing anywhere in Canada. Take the matter of Rideau Heights, which was a post-war fringe slum on the outskirts of the city. Now, there are other places like that right across Canada. And in a sense, they came out of the war because very little housing was built during the war, and people who had little or no means were scrambling around finding housing. And very little housing was built even right after the war. There was a tremendous boom, but it was a bit slow coming. So in the Rideau Heights area, people did the best they could, and they built themselves shacks made of tar paper and with mud floors, and there are no sewers there, and they had a service called night soil collection, which I will leave to your imagination. But what do you do about an area like Rideau Heights? Well, as I say, there are no precedents. The only example we had right across Canada was in the redevelopment of Regent's Park in the city of Toronto. And that was a very special sort of case, because that came about because of a public referendum whereby the citizens of Toronto voted money to redevelop the Regent's Park area in the center of Toronto. And that was the only precedent of its kind in Canada at that time. Now, there were quite a few examples of similar cases, both of the Rideau Heights phenomenon and the inner city slum area across the United States. And the planning board in Kingston and I became familiar with what was going on in various American communities, which are much like our own, and what was being done about these matters. And also in the United Kingdom, where they had had a much longer experience in both slum clearance and historic building preservation. And of course, they had had the National Trust for Historic Preservation in England for quite a number of years. And it was a very large and effective body. So, as I say, there are no precedents in Canada, but there are precedents elsewhere, which we studied. Say, how do we apply these precedents in Canada? So, we really didn't know what to do about Rideau Heights. There it was. But what do you do about it? There is no legislation to enable the municipality to do anything. A municipality can only do something if it is authorized to do it under provincial legislation, notably the Municipal Act, but other acts that came into being like the Planning Act and so forth. And the same thing with respect to historic building protection. How can you protect buildings when you have no authority? There are no bylaws. There's no legislation providing for the passing of bylaws. There wasn't anything at all. So how do you get at these things? We had a mayor who had bought a historic house and spent a lot of money restoring it. And he became quite interested in the whole subject of historic building preservation. And he and I attended a conference in Charleston, South Carolina, sponsored by the American Historic Trust Preservation. I think that's the proper title. And that's an organization that had been going for quite some time. And there is also an organization in Charleston that had been very successful. And we thought, we went to the conference and looked at Charleston, were suitably impressed, thought what a great idea for Kingston. Well, we came back and we decided that we needed a movement, shall we call it, or an organization in Kingston which would concern itself with historic building preservation. And one was established, and it wasn't a civic organization in the sense that it's in City Hall. It was a citizen organization, and it became the Frontenac Historic Foundation, still in existence and still very active. And the other was the matter of the lack of legislation. And we decided that the city should apply for special legislation from the interior government. Now, this came from a committee that had morphed out of the special committee that had been established to look at the City Hall portico. That committee was first of all focused only on the City Hall portico, had its activities extended to look at the whole historic building fabric of Kingston.
Would you know some of the people? Who were some of the people on the committee?
Well, certainly the mayor of the time was there, and that was Valerie Swain. Margaret Angus, the author of The Old Stones of Kingston. Colonel Leroy Grant, who was actually a professor at RMC and a sailing instructor, and he became a counselor and sat on the committee. And I've forgotten just who some of the others were in this time. We had a very interesting committee with respect to Rita Heights, though. The mayor appointed a special ad hoc committee, and we had on it social workers, ministers, politicians, and so forth. We said, now what do we do? What do we actually do? We said, first of all, we have to measure the problem and find out what are the dimensions of this problem in some depth. So we actually, on foot, as a committee, went from house to house in the Rita House area, talked to the people, discussed the shortcomings of the area, the conditions of the buildings and so forth. And this was all put into a report, which I believe was the first of its kind in Canada. We had the Regent's Park report, of course, but that was rather special. But there are no reports dealing with fringe areas, so we were first. So at least we had knowledge about the area, but then what to do about it. Well, it's funny how some things work out. About that time, we had in Canada, in Toronto, a very renowned international town planner named Gordon Stevenson. And he had come up from Australia, Western Australia, and he had received an appointment at MIT Harvard. But he couldn't cross the border because he couldn't get a visa, because this was the time of the McCarthy hearings in the United States. And Gordon Stevenson had worked for 6 months in Moscow after the war, and had also worked for the London England County Council, which was very socialist at the time and rather suspect in American eyes. So Gordon Stevenson got a short-time appointment at the University of Toronto, came here to Kingston to a conference at the Donald Gordon Center, and I met him quite accidentally. And we had a nice discussion, and he asked me to show him around Kingston. And I remember his words at the time. He said, "Show me the real Kingston. Not the Kingston we show the tourists. Fort Henry, St. George's Cathedral, City Hall, Queen's University." And I showed him Rita Heights. I said, "We have this problem, but we don't know what to do about it. There's no legislation, there's no money." He said, "Well, I think I can help you." Now, fortunately, Gordon Stevenson was very well connected with Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation and people in the federal government at Ottawa. And he was aware, as we were not aware, that a new program was coming on called the Urban Renewal Program. Now, although we had been ready to approach the federal government for funds, their view was that you can't take a single, in this case small area, out of isolation and do a rehabilitation of it, that it must be done as part of an overall plan of the municipality as a whole. And the federal government instituted what they call urban renewal studies right across Canada. And we were advised that if we did an urban renewal study, where in which urban planning for Rita Heights would be provided for, we could probably get approval and money for redevelopment of Rita Heights. So that's how this came about. Planning Study of Kingston, Ontario. This was the second urban renewal study in Canada. First one was in Halifax. The third, I believe, was in London, Ontario. And Gordon Stevenson was the consultant for this program and was exercised leadership, and I collaborated with him on the study. And having been all over the world and having the kind of reputation he had, he could see things in the community that those of us living here didn't notice. And he was also aware of ways and means of doing things about it. So the planning study was done. Now, it was perceived by the City of Council. It wasn't a plan in itself. Now, a section of the planning study contained a chapter on Rita Heights. Said, this is what you do about it. Now, there was a separate program for the actual implementation of urban renewal studies. Bear in mind that this was the study, but to implement it, you had to get into another program, which we did. And to make a long story short, Rita Heights was redeveloped. This overall plan drew attention to the importance of the historic building fabric of Kingston, the importance of downtown, and many other aspects of planning were covered by this overall study. And the various suggestions made were eventually all implemented under various studies. There were urban renewal studies for areas like Rideau Heights and Regents Park, right across Canada. And there are special redevelopment studies and plans for downtowns right across Canada, and especially in Ontario. And so under all these special programs, the recommendations in this study eventually, for the most part, were in fact implemented. That's how the system worked. With respect to the preservation of historic buildings, a great piece of publicity was The Old Stones of Kingston by Margaret Angus. It became a bestseller. Everybody's reading it, whether they had a historic house or not. And she pointed out to many things which could be done to preserve buildings and how important it was to preserve them. That is the key message. And also at that same time, we had an architect who took up residence in Kingston because her husband had received an appointment at Queen's. And she became quite interested in historic building preservation. And she did a special study of her own, of Sydenham Ward. And this became the subject of a talk she gave at the Agnes Etherington Arts Centre, which is one of the best attended public meetings they had ever had. It showed you that people were interested in the subject. Also about the same time.
Was that Lily Inglis? Who was that?
Lily Inglis.
Inglis.
Yes, she has passed on now, but there's a lane named after her in Sydenham Ward. About the same time, we had a request from the University of Toronto School of Architecture to assist with a study called a measurement study of historic buildings in Kingston by a group of senior students from the School of Architecture at the University of Toronto. And we were asked to be of assistance in directing their attention to houses we thought was important. Now this was done under the Historic Buildings Preservation Committee, nominally, and we arranged for their accommodation at Queen's and for their entry into various buildings. And we had a list of buildings for them. And this turned out to be quite an interesting exercise. Now, precise measurements are exactly that. They took precise measurements of the buildings, and they took photographs of them. The photographs, by the way, were taken by professional photographers, but the students did special drawings of each building by hand. And these were very fine representations. So we had these very good photographs and these good hand-drawn representations of historic buildings. And we thought these are worthy of some public examination. And we persuaded the Agnes Etherington Arts Centre to give an exhibition. And that turned out to be the exhibition that had the greatest attendance ever at the Agnes Etherington Arts Centre. So it showed that people were interested in this. And of course this hit the newspapers as well. So there was a lot of publicity about the whole subject. In the meantime, the Special Historic Buildings Committee had prepared a draft bylaw for historic preservation and persuaded council to adopt it and submit it to the Ontario government for approval. So it went down there, Now, it was approved. It is a special act for the City of Kingston, but it was never used because the members of our committee, who at that time included a lawyer, who was also the mayor, was convinced that the legislation as approved by the government was not workable. Now, the interesting thing there was that the draft bylaw we sent down came back completely unrecognizable to us from what we'd written. The government had completely rewritten it, so it wasn't our legislation anymore, it is theirs, but we consider it to be quite unsuitable. However, that started something rolling. We had our own local committee, the Kingston Historic Foundation, and the province thought that was a good idea, and they established a provincial association for the preservation of historic buildings, and they came up with their own provincial legislation for the preservation of buildings, and that was proclaimed by the Lieutenant Governor in the Kingston City Hall. So at last we had provincial legislation which gave the city control over the alteration of the appearance of historic buildings and over the possibility of demolition of historic buildings. So we knew we had to prepare a list of buildings that were to be the subject of the bylaw, and the buildings were listed as part of the bylaw. And as I mentioned, the more prominent buildings were, of course, quite easy to identify, and they became the subject of Volume 1, Buildings of Historic and Architectural Importance. So Volume 1 is fairly easy. Volume 2 was fairly easy because, again, we were into institutional buildings. Volume 3 was Portsmouth Village, which is interesting because it became important as the home of the 1976 Sailing Olympics. And the sailing portion of those Olympics was held in Kingston. The Olympics proper were held in Montreal, as you may remember. So we thought it'd be good public relations to do Portsmouth Village because people are interested in it. And in itself, we knew it as an important place historically, but a different kind of place, consisting mostly not of historic buildings, I should say institutional buildings, penitentiary accepted, but just houses. So once again, we had a student who spent the summer listing these buildings and talking to the people in them. Yes, there were some institutional buildings. There was the old penitentiary, which has now been vacated, and there was the old mental hospital, which is still there, and the old Portsmouth Town Hall, still there. So it had a few institutional buildings, but for the most part, it was a residential area. But these houses themselves, for the most part, were historic and architectural interest. So that accounted for Volume 3. Then the province got into the act of assisting municipalities renovate their downtowns. And Kingston got in on that program. So the 4th volume was downtown. And there are lots of historic buildings there, some of them institutional, but a lot of very good commercial buildings. So that became Volume 4. And then Volume 5 was a kind of catch-all for everything that hadn't been listed in the previous volumes. And if I remember correctly, Volume 6 may have been Queens, which is a very large special area with many historic buildings in it. And it deserved its own volume. And Volume 7 was also produced. So that's the history of that particular movement, which is still thriving. So it's interesting how these seem to be very finite problems at the beginning, like the demolition of the portico of the City Hall, or Rita Heights, how general planning considerations sort of took over, so that the municipality is being looked at as a whole, and its various aspects, of course, included Portsmouth, Rita Heights, downtown, so forth, Queen's University, and that. So you had a full-fledged planning program, shall we say, emerging out of this over the years. So I would say that Kingston, partly through happenstance, had a very good experience under these programs. You asked, we're not on now, so what were the prevailing attitudes towards urban renewal at the time? What was your thinking concerning urban renewal? We hadn't even heard about urban renewal beginning. You know, it is a foreign term, but I have a quotation here when you're ready.
Sure.
The attitude of Kingstonians generally, I think, can be nicely summed up in this little quote from a building called Kingston 300, a special book put out for the Kingston's tercentenary in 1973. And one chapter is written by a very well-known Kingstonian, Arthur M. Lower, professor of history. And here's the quote from Arthur Lower. A former mayor once said to me in some talk about the old buildings of Kingston, "Oh, I don't notice them. When you've lived here all your life, you never see them." Not surprisingly then, one of the accomplishments of this quaint old place seems to be the wrecking of one of its major titles to fame, its architecture. As a friend of mine once, a resident, said to me on a return visit, Kingston more or less resembles one of the wrecked towns I used to see during the war. And I think that was true at that time. Now, we're going back there to the early 1950s. And the general attitude has changed. Let's say there's been a development of not only a movement, but an attitude with respect to historic buildings, with respect to, let's call it fringe slum clearance. And one program I shouldn't have mentioned but didn't was the so-called Neighborhood Improvement Program, which was a plan for the redevelopment of inner city areas which had problems of poor housing, incompatible uses, and so forth. And by this time, not only the federal government, but the provinces were all getting involved in these types of problems. And there's a collaborative effort whereby the financing was 50% federal government, 25% provincial government, and 25% local government. And once again, there are certain requirements with respect to the neighborhood improvement areas, which are inner city. There is one requirement that sticks out in my mind, and it was this. citizen participation is mandatory. What does that really mean? In Kingston, when we were dealing with the so-called neighborhood improvement area, which here was the area generally north of Queen Street and east of Division Street and south of Concession Street and the Ridley River on the east side, there are lots of problems. Once again, we had to have a study, which was called the Neighborhood Improvement Study. And we were rather lucky there because at the same time we were approached by a group of students from the planning school of Queen's University who needed a project in order to complete their academic work. And they knew about the neighborhood improvement program before we knew about it. They knew it was coming online. And they offered their services gratis to conduct a survey of the area and make recommendations with regard to the improvement. So that was done. And getting back to the matter of citizen participation, here is an area that had no history of neighborhood organization or participation. There are one or two church parishes, one or two home and school organizations, but not a ward organization. In Kingston, there were other areas where they had full-fledged neighborhood organizations like the Sydenham Ward Ratepayers Association, the Grenville Park Association, but in this neighborhood improvement area, there is no organization of any kind. And yet it was a requirement of the program that there be citizen participation. So how do you arrange for that? Well, in the course of their examination of the area, the students got into conversations with many of the residents. And we also sought help from St. Lawrence College, who had a course in municipal administration. And they advised us to seek out the natural leaders in the area. They said they were sure there would be some natural leaders. So in talking to the people, two leaders, in fact, did emerge, one being a local parish priest, and the other a very well-known and highly regarded teacher. And we had meetings with them and with the St. Lawrence College people as how to go about this, and they all agreed we should call a big public meeting and see if anybody came. And the students helped by distributing circulars door to door to the entire area, advertising the meeting and the purpose of the meeting, which was to take advantage of this new federal provincial program. And would they have any ideas? And we rented one of the school auditoriums and wondered if anybody would come, because we were quite acquainted with having public meetings under the Planning Act, but there's a kind of standard procedure where you advertise and have the meetings all very formalized. But this was a little different. Well, the place was just packed with people. And in no time at all, the people there, without any help from us, organized themselves into block committees. We had 95 blocks and block captains and a steering committee, which was a kind of overall committee. And they agreed to work with us in determining an agenda for improvement of the area. Now, as part of the program, we had to get the plan that the students had prepared as a result of their survey approved by the federal government, and it was, and by council, of course. And we had to make an application. And you had to have a coordinator for the program, a person on staff. Now, the de facto chairman of the student group who originally came to us, there were 4 students, was a young woman named Mary Ellen Johnson, who was here in Kingston because her husband had accepted an appointment to Queen's. She had been a member of the Calgary Board of Education, and she was taking the planning course at Queen's University. And she applied and secured the position, and she was the perfect person because she had to work with the residents, work with the planning staff in the preparation of the final plan, and the application for approval of the plan and for financing. And all this was done. Now, I won't go into all the details, but a number of blighted houses were removed. A number of non-conforming uses like used car lots and so forth removed. People wanted to clean up their area, wanted to get rid of these things. They were short of parks, they wanted more parks. We were able to provide them with some parkettes because there wasn't much vacant land in the area at all. And we provided playground equipment in the schoolyards. It's one of the things that people wanted. And they wanted the libraries and the schools kept open at night for the use of the people living in the area, not just the children during the daytime. But above all, they wanted a community swimming pool in the area. And that was approved and built with the funds from the program. The first year it was an open air pool, and then a roof was put on it. And that pool is in very active use today as an overall community pool, not just for the neighborhood improvement area, but it's a well-used pool. But that was the icing on the cake, so to speak, for the people of the neighborhood improvement area. Now, at the same time, the provincial and federal governments brought in parallel programs of assisted housing loans for people who wanted to fix up their dwellings but didn't have much money. And depending upon your income, you could get a low interest rate loan to fix up your house, or if you're poor enough, you could get a grant. So it's true to say that any home that needed fixing up in the neighborhood improvement area was in fact fixed up under the program. The program was very successful. Now, there were 2 programs. One was provincial, which applied to the whole municipality. The federal program only applied to the neighborhood improvement area. But within the neighborhood improvement area, you could also get the provincial plan to work. So it was called ORP. So you could ORP in a NIP area, but you couldn't NIP in an ORP area. So we had these 2 programs going, which were very, very successful. On the drive through the neighborhood improvement area today, you wouldn't think of it as being different from any other old area. It's still an old area, but it's in good condition. Same thing applies to the Rita Heights area. You wouldn't know Rita Heights today from the area that I first knew, consisting of the tar paper shacks and the mud floors. It's gone. It's just like any ordinary suburb up there now. So both those programs are very successful. Now, I think one of the lessons in this is that municipalities don't have the resources to do all these things themselves. They need help. So they got help from both provincial and federal governments. I must now say something about how this whole thing became very widespread and publicly accepted. Central Mortgage established the Community Planning Association of Canada, presumably a citizens' organization, but financed very heavily by Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And it turned out an excellent monthly publication on planning matters in Canada, on everything, slum clearance, even traffic plans. Almost anything you can think of that touches planning at all was dealt with by people writing articles and by the organization holding big conferences that members of planning boards and councils across Canada went to. They were very well attended conferences. And ideas were floated at these conferences, of course, and then taken back home. And lots of the ideas that we were able to apply in Kingston came from having gone to Charleston or some other place. So there's a cross-fertilization there, which was of tremendous assistance right across the country. So I think I can say that the general residential fabric communities right across Canada has been improved immeasurably since the end of the war through these various programs. There's nothing wrong with high density in itself at all. In fact, it's very necessary today. If you're going to have efficient cities, we can't forever sprawl out with suburbs. They, in fact, are very costly to a municipality, and a municipality, if it does not have a corresponding industrial commercial assessment, can often be put into a bankrupt position because it lacks these sources of revenue. You can't put everything on the house property tax itself. You've got to have these other sources of revenue. Kingston on the whole has done very well, partly through luck. Some very large companies came here during the war, like Alcan and stayed, and the nylon plant. And in a sense, Queen's University is an industry, big employer. And so some things are just a matter of luck. The penitentiaries is a big industry too. A lot of employees collectively there. And because of our location on a beautiful lake with 1,000 islands, we have a huge tourist industry here. So Kingston is in a very good position. Other municipalities aren't quite so fortunate as we are. But I think there's a general recognition now of what it takes to make a municipality work today and to provide good living accommodation and employment opportunities. And you really do have to have a mixture of these things, and they have to be properly located so that they aren't, so to speak, bumping up against one another. And this is the problem right now of putting a very high rise in the middle of a low rise area. As far as many people are concerned, it just doesn't fit in. Other people think it's just fine because it brings more people living downtown who buy more downtown and so forth, you see, so there's quite a division of opinion here, but as I say, it depends on how it's done. I think where I live, it's been done very well, partly through good luck. You see, there's a very old plan there dating back to the time of the Loyalist settlement when the first survey of Upper Canada was done, and there's a monument for this right on King Street, just west of West Street. The first survey of Upper Canada was done there. That's ground zero. And all the surveys throughout southern Ontario emanate from that point. Now, most of the country is divided up into huge agricultural plots because they were going to farm, you see. But they did leave some little urban plans like Kingston, Brockville, Bath, Glenora, saying that now there are going to be a few towns here, they'll need a street system. And they left a little plan of the street system. And right where I live, that old street system is still there. Now, the ownership of streets is always vested in the municipality. So while the land down there is being sold to developers, they couldn't buy the streets. So this left lots of open space. So you don't get the impression of high density because those buildings are spread well apart and they got the street allowances there. So as I say, it's how it's done that makes quite a difference. And occasionally you'll get quite a nice looking high-rise as a single building in a single family subdivision, but just the one building. But this is a matter of civic design, and you really have to go to the larger cities to see good examples of civic design, mixed design, and so forth. And now there's a feeling that you don't necessarily need high-rise downtown, but you need people in these second and third stories in the commercial areas. And Kingston, for quite a long time, has had a program of financial assistance to enable developers to develop apartments on these second and third stories downtown. The program has not been widely publicized, but it has been used. So again, that's a matter of civic design. It's a very unusual city, Kingston. The social fabric here, partly because of the university, penitentiary complex, and the Alcan and the big firms, they brought in people from outside, very professional people, highly educated, a lot of them, as well as standard workforce, who had worked in different parts of the world, and they brought in a sort of different viewpoint. Kingston, I think, had been very insular, right up until the end of the war. And I'm sure you've heard the old jokes about you're not a Kingstonian until you've had 2 generations buried in Little Cataraqui Cemetery. It is quite a shock to us when my wife and I came here. We came here from Kitchener, not residents of Kingston originally, but I don't know if you know Kitchener. It's a very business-oriented town, a lot of vitality, very well organized, very dynamic place. And we came here, boy, was it stayed. It really was stayed. And you were either a loyalist, Queens, medical, or military, or you weren't part of the society here. It is very well defined here. Yeah. Now they couldn't define me because I wasn't a Queens graduate. I was Toronto graduate. I wasn't loyalist. They couldn't slot me.
Yeah.
It rather amused us. After we came here, we were looking for a house. It was quietly known to us that if we would like to live in Grenville Park, we were socially acceptable. I'm not kidding. And there was a big thing here once called the Medical Wives Charity Ball. And they had the not the RMC, but the Fort Henry guard, I think, would come and they danced the cotillion,
Yes.
and they always had some person of importance who would be the chairman and chair lady of the ball, I think. One year they got actual royalty here. Some obscure principality in Europe produced a couple called Their Serene Highnesses, something, that was their title. Nobody had ever heard of them, or the principality either. Something like Monaco, you know. But, you know, the big thing hits all the papers, you know. And the most socially, presumably desirable young girls in Kingston would be invited to the big charity ball.
That sounds very 19th century.
Oh, very, very. Oh, yes. When I first came here, I belonged to the St. George's Cathedral, still do. They had the St. George's Society. They had a big banquet once a year, strictly male. No women.
Wow.
Yeah, there are lots of stories. Those are all mildly critical, not intended to be terribly critical. On the other hand, especially now, there are very strong social organizations here, like the United Appeal, you know, and some very strong ward associations like Sydenham Ward, and all kinds of charitable associations working very hard and doing a lot of good. Very active Salvation Army. I was on the Salvation Army board for a few years. And doing all sorts of specialized work, for example, for handicapped children, boys and girls clubs, so forth. A lot of that in Kingston. It's very well organized. And it's a society that cares for people. I think it's very important here. It was pretty stiff when we first came here. Of course, it was a much smaller community, and it had this rather distinct history, you know, which is it is different from other places. One thing now, I'll give you another example. The downtown, it was pretty bad there for a while. It needed organization, and we needed good people. And we got them people, you may remember Len Dover of Dover's Menswear.
Okay.
Very good person. It began to get organized, and we had good people there, and that's very important. And in my experience, in any of these things, you always need that one person who's a spark plug.
Yes.
Yeah, and usually there's somebody there around who's a spark plug,
Yeah.
and can get things going and has the respect of the community. But you know, there are people downtown who wouldn't, merchants who wouldn't talk to one another because they'd fought in the schoolyard as kids. You know, it is unbelievable. But that all changed.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, do you remember the names of?
Oh, you must remember them, the Chowns. You don't hear of them anymore.
No, you don't.
Chowns Hardware. Stacy's,
Yes.
gone. S&R, gone.
Abramsky?
Ramsky's. The family are still here, but they're only in the real estate business. They're not in the retail business anymore. But they're very strong here and also very charitable. I might say that quite active in that way. I think one of the most prominent people here is probably Britt Smith. Yeah, Homestead Real Estate.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Again, a very charitable man. Oh, I was talking about the complex where I live with apartment buildings. You know, there's a park down there now. Quite a nice park in the waterfront called Battery Park. And it's a godsend to that whole area because it sort of ties it together. It gives it a wonderful outlook on the lake. It's nicely landscaped. Now, it is done through collaboration of two of the developers, Britt Smith being one of them, and the Marriott Hotel the other, with the city. And the end result is that there's a public park there, but it's not owned by the city. It's still owned by those developers, but they granted the city a right-of-way. In return, the city looks after it like a public park. And for all intents and purposes, it's not a public park. It is a public park by use, but it's not owned by the city as a public park. That's privately owned land. But it works beautifully. And there are other examples like that around. There is a general spirit of cooperation in Kingston. Sometimes they make mistakes, we all do. But it's such a beautiful place with all the scenery we have around here. And it's the very community in which to live and to be brought up. I'm glad my kids are brought up here. And they like coming back. Well, I think I'll go now if you're finished with me.